So this is the 3 o'clock GMT, that is 0300 hours GMT edition of the KhoodeelaarTV television channel, broadcasting under the theme of BabyAngelGeronimo Editions. This is 0300 hours GMT on Friday, 23rd of September 2022. I'm Muhammad Haque, created this and devised this and written this and am presenting this program. I have been presenting similar programs for a very long time, since way before the internet came into being. The only format was the different format at the given times. I have been doing things that can be called journalism. Only difference being that my journalism has not been in return for money. I have been doing journalism only in terms of form, but in terms of contents, my work has remained and continues to remain and shall remain forever different from the contents of the absolute majority of the professional court journalists. I have, of course, been a member of in the UK, of the National Union of Journalists, but that has been, again, a form. In terms of substance, I have seriously disagreed with most of the members of the NUJ who are lacking in morality, ethics, and so on. And this became particularly the issue while doing an experiment or taking part in an experiment in 1981 in a thing called East End News. The East End News was set up by a number of the NUJ's then recalcitrant, so-called radical, self-styled radical members, including the racist Jacob Eccleston and the racist Mike Jemson. Now, this particular one, Mike Jemson, the racist, is now, if you look at the internet, you will find that he is expanded, he's ballooned into an empire of his own. He has been all over the place. Now, this was the Mike Jemson, the racist, that caused the serious problem in getting the East End News on a course that was actually reporting on Eastern News. Until the onset of the Eastern News experiment of 1981, this Mike Jemson, whom I call Mike Jem Shit, this racist claimed that he was not following the same editorial bias and racist prejudice followed by the rest of the then East London idiotizer. Idiotizer is my name for the East London advertiser. So I'm talking about the 1970s. The East London idiotizer published several pieces about the community in the East End of London, and especially around the protests following the racist murder of Al-Tabali in 1978. But it never came anywhere near reporting the truth about the situation in the East End of London. When the uncle and nephew, Ismat Ali and Watir Ali, were attacked in their flat in the Flower and Dean Walk along the Brick Lane in July 1989. It was followed by a demonstration organized not by me, but organized by other people who disappeared by the time we arrived at the actual critical junction in the middle of the Bethnal Green Road on the 15th of July 1989. It fell on me to really lead the actual demonstration at that point. And I invited the fellow demonstrators to sit down, blocking the traffic going through Bethnal Green Road. That was part of the protest at the arrest of one or two or three people by the police whose Bethnal Green headquarters was situated literally a few yards from where we sat in the middle of the road in Bethnal Green Road. Where we sat is near the actual junction with Wilmot Street, Bethnal Green Road to Wilmot Street. So we sat down, and my pictures are contained in the report in the following week's edition of the East London Idiotizer as holding the microphone and directing the demonstration. But the contents of the demonstration, of the report about the demonstration, were completely racist and ignorant of the events, and most certainly ignorant of the role of the police. Now, in the previous edition of the KhoodeelaarTV television channel, we talked about the Times newspaper reporting about most people are let down by the Metropolitan Police. And also the Daily Mirror, front page on the Daily Mirror Thursday, about the little child Olivia who was murdered in Liverpool and the reward of £200,000 being announced to find the killer. And in the beginning, at the beginning of September, there was this murder by the police, shooting of a black man who was innocent, who was driving a car, and he was shot dead at point blank range near the windscreen of the car, driver's side, I think. And he was, according to the reports in the Guardian and elsewhere, I think, that he was driving a car. It wasn't his car, somebody else's car, maybe borrowed a friend's car or something, that had been on the police monitoring kind of system, referring to it as having been involved with gun crime or involved with incident that showed that the car had been used for carrying guns by individuals. This individual who has been murdered by the police didn't carry a gun and wasn't involved in the criminality. Now, the police in 1981, as I said previously, we were talking about Leslie Scarman's Scarman report. The Scarman report was feted by the media and highly exaggerated as a milestone achievement in policing analysis, the society's attitude towards the police. And it was claimed that this Scarman report would change policing. Well, the Scarman report did contain a long list of recommendations, but it didn't change the policing. Nor did the Macpherson report on policing that was commissioned after the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence in April 1993 in Eltham in southeast London. And although the BabyAngelGeronimo regime or the Labour Party, let's say, put Stephen Lawrence's mother into the House of Peers as a kind of compensation, she remains unsatisfied with the role and the behavior and the conduct and the attitude of the police. So, where is the police inadequacy going to be kind of corrected by? What is going to correct the police inadequacy? My answer is that the police inadequacy is more than inadequacy. My analysis, based on facts and observation and empirical evidence, I'll come to the empirical bits shortly, shows that there is no policing. What there is a set of organization groups and gangs in uniform that are really not operating as police, but as gangs. Their main purpose is to address the community, the population, at worst by intimidating targeted individuals rather than detecting crime, rather than prosecuting crime. And the Crown Prosecution Service, which was for 5 years fronted by the Director of Public Prosecution, the man that held the top position in the CPS, Keir Starmer, is, in terms of policing, a dead organization, an ineffective organization, a dead organization, and for most purposes, a corrupt organization. That reflects the overall corruption that dominates policing across the country, policing within quotation marks. All the utterances or incidents of policing in this edition or in these broadcasts should be treated as being intended to be within quotation mark. The fact that this 9-year-old child, the girl who was murdered while she was hiding behind her mom, who was herself shot, the fact that this little child's murderer is not yet caught, and the 200,000 pounds reward has had to be announced to entice informants to shop this murderer, shows that there is no policing. Whatever happened to the millions of CCTV and other technological kind of devices that are supposed to be monitoring crimes and criminal activities? These are central issues of failures of the state to do its basic actual duties to the people, the citizens, so called. And these are not at all at the top of the agenda of discussion, debate, either in the so-called Fleet Street, the mainstream media, or in Parliament. So it's a failed state, the United Kingdom. We shall, of course, cover policing in terms of the empirical evidence that I have had. In Brick Lane, a few years ago, before the building was kind of changed, this thing that a Bangla Town kind of complex. Was it Bangla Town or something? I mean, I'll have to check the name and update on that one. This was being sold, and it has been sold, and it has been sold at exaggerated values. It was owned by Abbas Uddin Elias Halal and some others. So when this building was being kind of changed, the frontage was being changed, I wanted to note, photographically mark the change. So I aimed my camera at the frontage, and as I stood in the Fournier Street, very much near the entrance to the Brick Lane Jama Masjid. And two male white policemen approached me and asked me to stop the photography. I was not committing a crime. I was not doing anything of the sort. And one of the policemen said that he could actually do me under Terrorism Act. Can you imagine? This is what he said. I mean, how easy has it been for terrorism offenses to be applied to intimidate somebody who was taking a picture of the frontage of the street in Brick Lane? And I am the most active photographer of Brick Lane over the last 50 years plus. So that is the empirical evidence. The police intimidation, police criminality, because Terrorism Act should not have been threatened against me because I was taking a picture. No threat should have been made against me. I was asked to give my date of birth and my address. I mean, for what? I did give that, but for what purpose? So if I am being treated in that way as a criminal, as a terrorist, for taking pictures in Brick Lane, what does it say about the attitude that the Metropolitan Police in London fosters towards and against people of particular appearance or ethnicity or whatever? Now, that is the summary of the absence of policing. As I said, I mean, this is the behavior of thugs, not police. Then I wrote to the Metropolitan Police asking for some information. And the reply read as follows: Muhammad, etc., etc. I mean, this individual who called me Muhammad had no idea that that is not the way to address a correspondent. And I only wrote as a result of a chain of communications that followed my previous attempts to get information from the then commander of police, Metropolitan Police in Tower Hamlets. That was offensive, aggressive, and totally insulting. Muhammad. It was like the behavior of the Metropolitan Police, who used to come and knock on the door always in the middle of the night. When I was registered as an interpreter for the police, I never ever worked for the police as an interpreter. But my name had been put on at the list at the time as an interpreter. The police never came during the day, and they came always during the night. And the knock on the door was like a thug beating up the door. It was an intimidation right from the beginning. And it was a plot to find an excuse and do criminal damage or criminal violence against me under a pretext of trying to get me to interpret something always in the middle of the night. Why would they do that? And there is no recourse. And the Guardian, its coverage is a cover up, because the Guardian knows that there is no recourse for the absence of policing and the substitution of what used to be or supposed to be the policing by thuggery. And the Daily Mail and the scum have attacked Sadiq Khan over Sadiq Khan's alleged way of sacking Cressida Dick as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Sadiq Khan is a stooge of the police. Sadiq Khan never did anything to upset, let alone to violate the rights of Cressida Dick or any of the other police post holders. If Sadiq Khan had been doing his job, then policing would have been revolutionized in London. Because all the people that Sadiq Khan knows have got empirical evidence, personal evidence, experience of police misbehaving. And when police misbehave, it's a very risky thing. Who is going to hold the police to account to make the police behave? And that has never been really answered. That has never been examined, despite the fact that the behavior of Wayne Couzens, first in lying to Sarah Everard, then luring her into his kind of control and command, and then raping her, and then burning her body. Where do you begin the horror? I mean, that happened in London, in the Metropolitan Police, while Cressida Dick was in post as the Commissioner of the Police. What happened? Nothing. And Sarah Everard was not even a black person. She was a white young woman who otherwise is supposed to be protected from this kind of treatment, or the kind of treatment that most black people expect and are treated with. Sarah Everard was a blonde, white young woman. She was lied to by the police, serving policeman, and she was misled into his custody. She was raped, and her body was burnt. It didn't happen somewhere remotely in Africa or Asia. It happened in London. And the perpetrator, only one perpetrator was identified as Wayne Couzens. But the entirety of the Metropolitan Police is populated by people doing all kinds of crimes. So who is holding the police to account? In 1981, when we were doing the East End News, or trying to do the East End News, one of the two most ongoing, most kind of common themes was the behavior of the police who kind of invaded a particular party or something. As a result of that, I mean, I'm cutting a long story short. As a result of that, the thing called CAPA, Community Alliance for Police Accountability, was formed in Jar Hamlets. We found that this was mainly made up of people who were white and racist, and were therefore in deep denial of the racist depth of the police behavior. So they became part of the extension of the police rather than part of the process to hold the police to account. So soon we began to call them COPA. CAPA became COPA. And it goes on. And there is no accountability by the police. And most people, well, I have never set out. I've never set out to commit a crime or do a wrong thing. And I've never been prosecuted, and I've never been really found. Well, I have been prosecuted, but I'll come to that in a minute. I never got convicted of any crime because I never committed a crime. Now, the prosecution was done by Ken Livingston Livingstone. Ken Livingston Livingstone did the prosecution following the fight that I was involved in at the Royal Festival Hall in 1985, in May 1985. After one of Ken Livingstone's stooges, a councillor in Camden, a councillor from West Bengal in Camden. Now, this was a parasite. There are several parasites from West Bengal that actually ingratiate themselves to the mainly Siloti-speaking communities so that they can misrepresent themselves as being leaders of the Silotis, the Bengalis, Bangladeshis, and then become councillors, which is what this particular one did. Now, the fight with him began or took place after he said something very, very criminal. I'm not going to repeat that, and I have not repeated that ever. As a result of that, Ken Livingstone was approached by this criminal, and I was arrested at County Hall. It was a politically staged arrest. And then I was prosecuted, and the prosecution took place. The trial took place several days. And there was no way that I could be found guilty because I had not done any crimes. And I gave evidence, which was based on the facts, that it was a prosecution created by Ken Livingstone. Can you believe that? Ken Livingstone used a Bengali from West Bengal to have me prosecuted. Why? Because he couldn't prosecute me for all the hundreds of interventions that I made against him. So he used this pathetic parasite Bengali councillor from Camden. I mean, while I was preparing for the defense, I noticed that the solicitor who I had to instruct made about 10 separate appointments to get the facts from me. What was she doing? She was abusing the legal aid funds. That is what she was doing. There is no way that anything I said between two sittings differed in any significant way whatsoever. This is what corrupt licensed law traders do, and they discredit the legal aid system, so-called. And this one did. I mean, years earlier, Harry Mundy, a criminal, legal aid executive operating in a soul cheaters firm called Garston Garstly. Garston is the name of the firm that was based near the Tottenham Court Road. I call them Ghastly. And Harry the liar Mundy faked so many appointments for the family because it was a family thing. Our family was being under legal notice by the Tower Hamlets Council over environment. The environmental notices began in the late 1960s concerning an address in New Road.
London E1, 1HE. So the defense that I created, because until I took over, there was no defense. So the defense I created remained consistent, absolutely consistent, right from the word go and until the prosecution fell apart with the Town Council employee bursting into tears in the court as a result of the weight of evidence that I had organized and mobilized against him. And this criminal was called, can you believe it? He had a name. The German name, Hitler's book's name. He was Peter Kemp. Mein Kampf. This was Peter Kemp, who we forced to burst into tears in a court in the 1970s. And Harry Mundy interviewed me on the facts about 10 to 15 times and raised the legal aid bills claimed against us to the legal aid fund by the ghastly firm of crooks operating as soul cheaters. So the actual evidence from Tocksteth to Tower Hamlets, let's say, of relationship between the police and the related agency, the soul cheaters or licensed law traders, with people of African or Asian backgrounds and ordinary people of the white backgrounds as well, ordinary people. The evidence is strongly based on the evidence that it is biased, it's prejudiced, and it shows the state dysfunctioning. Now, take the licensed law traders and the criminals, their criminality into the criminality perpetrated, practiced by most of the members of the staff in the various courts of so-called law. And most members of the judiciary are corrupt to the core, as I keep saying. David Neuberger, who was the first incumbent in the post created for the Supreme Court, so called, he was the president of the Supreme Court. Neuberger was hired by David Lidington. Lidington was Theresa May's de facto deputy. Lidington wanted to have a kind of quote big time name or big name singing the praise of Brexit. So he found the most tenuous link based on the gathering of Australian lawyers or Australians in the UK, which was addressed by David Neuberger. And Neuberger said, according to the piece in July 2017, published by the evening No Standard, and its racist spy boy, Martin Bentham, so-called Home Affairs editor. That plug by Martin Bentham, the spy boy, claimed that David Neuberger had said that once Brexit was done, well, he didn't use the word done, but effectively that's what he meant. That after Brexit, let's say, London would become the center of the world's litigation. I mean, David Neuberger must have been salivating at the mouth or in the mouth as he said that. And David Neuberger must have fainted in excitement that Neuberger delivered as he was touted to deliver as a prostitute for the corrupt, immoral legal bureaucracy in Britain. Neuberger was hired as the about to retire president of the so-called Supreme Court. As we know, the Supreme Court is a prostitute court because what they have done in the case of Shamima Begum, by rubber stamping Priti Patel's ugly, racist, anti-Muslim kind of agenda, they overlooked the fact that the Canadian spies and the British counterparts were actually the ones that did the passage of Shamima Begum and the other two girls out of the UK into Syria. That is what has now been revealed. As we knew, not necessarily those particular details, but there was no way that these children, Shamima Begum and the other two, well, the other three, but we are leaving out the first one because she traveled separately from the surprise East London Mosque, because she was groomed at the East London Mosque by the Sisters Forum, who was part of the Islamic Forum Europe. Can you imagine these names and these contraptions? Under all these banners of Islamic Forum Europe, Sisters Forum, what they were doing business as traffickers of little girls, dressed them as terrorists. And the local Tower Council, as the local council, had the duty to safeguard these children, which duty the Tower Council predictably and persistently refused and failed to carry out. Most of the time that these girls were relevant in the relevant age or age group, the incumbent in the post of the leader of the council or the mayor at the expense of the Tower borough was none other than Lutfur Rahman. And Lutfur Rahman blinked, and he is blinking even now. All his peddlers and liars in the community and on the council have been lying in denial about their duties of the council as owed to these children, these three girls. When I spoke to Lutfur Rahman on Friday, the 29th of October 2010, just outside the Brick Lane Mosque, I told him that he had to sit down with me and listen to me and do the urgent things to stop the rot in the council. Otherwise, he would end up bringing the community into greater disrepute than it had already been into. And as Richard Morey observed, Lutfur Rahman never speaks even loud enough to be heard. He didn't say anything loudly. He idiotically and ignorantly and stupidly and dishonestly, congenitally dishonestly, spewed words that were supposed to reassure me that he would sit down with me. He said words to the effect that he would do that after settling down in the post of elected mayor. that he had been declared to have been elected to. That was on the 21st of October. So 8 days after that, I spoke to him. He never sat down with me to listen to me, and he lied, therefore. During the years that Luther Roman was in post as the incumbent in the post of the corrupt post of the mayor at the expense of Tower Hamlets, Luther Roman paid public money that must have amounted to more than several millions. এটা তার বাফাইতি সম্পত্তি আছিল না, এটা পাবলিকর পয়সা. He gave this money to series of serial liars and criminals. And none of those criminals in the list that I'm about to kind of elaborate on could have been known to Luther Roman. Luther Roman's political horizon never existed. As put accurately by Abbas Uddin Elias Helal, Luther Roman was brainwashed in the East London Mosque by the Islamic Forum, Europe or similar. So his political horizon never existed. A number of known criminals operating via the East London Mosque and the Islamic Forum, Europe and the East London and the London Muslim Center. Those criminals are, some of them, those criminals, are still employed in Tower Hamlets Council under this or that pretext. So Luther Roman was a beneficiary, is a beneficiary, remains a beneficiary of the institutional individual corruption, racism, and criminality that dominate the Metropolitan Police. So where do the people of Tower Hamlets go to in order to secure accountability, let alone due service and protection from the local council? Where could these three girls go? I mean, at the ages of 14, 15, these girls were trafficked. And as became clear in the case of Shamima Begum, they were actually trafficked as sex slaves. I mean, she began having children at the age of 15 or 16, I mean, within very short time after arriving in Syria. And it was happening brazenly. And none of the Fleet Street, none of the British Parliament, none of the so-called kind of decent people who accuse Muslims of having girls become pregnant very early age, none of those criminals has ever come on the record as decrying this, deriding this behavior of openly converting these children into prostitutes, into sex slaves, trafficked into Syria. And let me say again, there was no revolution in Syria happening in Syria or in the so-called Islamic State. All of these have been designed by the Americans and the British and their collaborators. And Fleet Street knows this, the MPs know this, and others know this, but they are silent. And there is no outlet in the so-called David Neuberger Center of the world's leading legal dispute resolutions, the London courts. There is no proceeding. examining the evidence of the criminality of the state. There is an incidental item as I speak. At what time am I speaking? 03:44 hours GMT, equivalent to 04:44 hours British Standard Time, so called. On Thursday, in his first appearance as a backbencher, the congenital liar Boris Johnson turned out to be a fan of Vladimir Putin. Apparently, this is being treated as a gaffe. But it could be possible that Boris Johnson was actually admitting gratitude for Vladimir Putin's help in getting Brexit done. We shall be coming to all these topics and others in due course, but before concluding this particular edition, let me go back to the 1960s and a university hall of residence called Haji Mohsin Hall in Nilkhet, not far from the New Market in the city of Dhaka, not far from the race course. And in the Haji Mohsin Hall, it became reported that a student on the 5th or 6th floor had been keeping his girlfriend in an almirah in his room. Think about that. And the details are too ghastly to actually retail. So we shall come to an end of this particular edition, but we shall come to talk more about this and the two people who spoke English in the most unforeseen way, that is, unforeseeable way, unforeseeable by Thomas Babington, the racist Macaulay. One is a rickshaw driver, and another was a man who used to sell English language paperback books around the university campus. Now, those two became proficient in English. But in the case of the rickshaw driver, his proficiency was hilarious because he hardly understood what he was spewing. What he did was, over years of driving people who spoke English in a rickshaw, he picked up phrases, quite a few phrases and sentences in English that had nothing to do with what he was doing. Because when he would pick up the natives or the local people, and in the event of any rows or disagreements with them over fares or about the routes that he was taking, he would stun them by delivering a spontaneous barrage of English sentences, or what sounded like English sentences. And these men would be stunned into silence, mostly men. Why? Because they had no idea what he was saying. But one thing they had an idea of was that he was speaking English. And English remained the symbol of threat, intimidation, authority, power. Speak English is a refrain that has been heard in the chamber of the Tower Hamlets Council chamber. And it came mainly from Peter Goals. Peter Goals, the racist, is also the racist who is the best friend or who is the main contact of the fascist anti-Muslim, Katie Hopkins. And Peter Golds is the one that said on an edition of the Reality with Mahi Ferdaus Jalil, that the demand for the particular council ward to be called Spitalfields and Bangla Town was wrong, because calling it Bangla Town is like calling for a street or a ward to be called after kangaroos. In that particular edition, the presenter, so-called Mahi Ferdaus Jalil, not only didn't object, but he added his own insult addressed at the people of Tower Hamlets, like your bara or Afnarar bara. It is the same criminal, Mahi Ferdaus Jalil, who has been bribed to the equivalent tunes of millions of pounds by Tower Hamlets councils controlling decision makers under the corrupt and criminal influence of Lutfur Rahman. Various properties have been given, practically given away to this criminal, convicted criminal Mahi Ferdaus Jalil. Any criminal boy saying that the so-called media, ethnicity-linked media in Tower Hamlets, feeding off the Bangladeshi, ordinary Bangladeshi people, any criminal boy saying that these criminals are not doing the crimes must come forward on the record, and then they will find themselves at the receiving end of clear legal action notices. Not long before the so-called first election to the corrupt post of mayor that took place in October 2010, there was a so-called hustings held at one of the churches near the Sutton Street. And outside the church, I found Andrew Gilligan. It was probably 6th of October 2010. I found Andrew Gilligan either talking to some other people or standing there. So I said to him, I asked him, and I said words to the effect that I never heard of the Islamic Forum Europe. How dare he, Andrew Gilligan, suggest that Tower Hamlets was dominated by the Islamic Forum Europe? I gave him a piece of my mind on the record, and the record was being made by channel slaves, and Muhammad Jubair, the infant boy, was the one who witnessed that and witnessed the actual recording, and he knows the recording took place and he watched it afterwards. How? How do I know that? Because he said to me at an event that followed that particular encounter with Andrew Gilligan, he said words to the effect that he saluted me for doing the analysis of Gilligan's. Little does this boy, infant Jubair, know that I have been doing this long before he literally, biologically, was even born. That is me. That is what I do. It was not a one-off incident. It was not a rare event. So we shall be coming to an end to this particular edition at 6 minutes to, what is the British Standard Time, is 6 minutes to 5. 6 minutes to 4 GMT on Friday, the 23rd of September 2022.